Jeffrey Dahmer was captured in a West Side apartment building. How this case changed this city.
And tomorrow, a man named Ted Bundy was going to die in Florida's electric chair.
Serial criminals have fascinated us for decades, as their atrocious crimes have left a permanent mark on society.
Well, I'm not an expert. I'm not an authority. I'm someone who has been a murderer for almost 20 years.
In this video, we'll be looking at the top 15 worst serial killers in history. Instead of ranking them by the number of victims, we'll examine the gruesome and depraved ways they carried out their murders and their blatant disregard for human life. We do hope you're ready. Number 15. Robert Berdella. Robert Berdella, also known as the Kansas City Butcher, was an American serial murderer who operated in Kansas City during the 1980s. Berdella was a sadistic criminal known to have taken the lives of at least 6 men between 1984 and 1987 using brutal torture methods. He often targeted young Caucasian men who were either sex workers or acquaintances of his. Once he had them in his house, he would drug them with alcohol, sedatives, or animal tranquilizers and restrain them to a bed in his basement with piano wire. Over a few days to several weeks, Berdella would torture his victims in various ways, including electric shock, beating with various instruments, and sodomy. He also applied window caulk to their ears, bleach to their eyes, drained cleaner into their vocal cords, and gouged their eyes. He documented the process with a camera and kept a detailed log before eventually taking their lives, usually with a plastic bag. After their deaths, he would dismember the bodies and leave them inside trash bags to be picked up by garbage collectors. He occasionally kept body parts, wallets, and IDs as trophies. In March 1988, Berdella abducted his last victim, Chris Bryson, and imprisoned him in his basement, just like his previous victims. While Berdella was away at work, Bryson made a daring escape by jumping from a second-story window. Berdella died on October 8, 1992, of a heart attack while serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Number 14. Delphine LaLaurie. Madame Delphine LaLaurie was an American socialite born around 1775 in New Orleans to an Irish family. She married physician Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie in 1825, and in 1832 she had a 2-story mansion built at 1140 Royal Street, where she lived with her husband, 2 daughters, and enslaved people. However, between 1831 and 1834, LaLaurie tortured and mistreated enslaved people, and at least 12 enslaved people died in her care. The crimes came to light in April 1834 when a fire broke out in the LaLaurie residence, revealing the horrible mutilation and torture. Bystanders found 7 enslaved people mutilated and suspended in the quarters. LaLaurie had a sadistic streak and was known for her cruel treatment of enslaved people, despite being concerned about their health in public. She was also a wealthy woman and a prominent member of New Orleans society. The rumors surrounding the discovery of the enslaved people have muddied the facts throughout the years, but a few details remain true. First, the locals found the enslaved people in the attic, and second, they had been tortured. Uncorroborated reports from eyewitnesses claim that at least 7 enslaved people were beaten, bruised, and bloodied to within an inch of their lives, with some having their eyes gouged out, skin flayed, and mouths filled with excrement before being sewn shut. Although LaLaurie and her husband fled New Orleans after the fire, it is unclear what happened to her afterward. Despite a plaque commemorating the events and the house's status as a popular tourist attraction, the location of LaLaurie's final resting place remains a mystery. Number 13. Fritz Honka. Friedrich Paul Fritz Honka was a German serial criminal who operated in Hamburg's red light district during the early 1970s. He was responsible for the deaths of at least 4 women who were all sex workers. Honka worked as a night watchman for Shell, and his crimes occurred between 1970 and 1975. Honka's modus operandi was to strangle his victims, dismember, and hide them in his apartment or attic. He did this with all his victims, 3 whose disappearances were not reported to the police. When other tenants reported unpleasant smells from Honka's apartment, he used pine-scented perfume blocks to mask the odor. Honka's victims were explicitly chosen from the red light district, where he would frequent bars and brothels. He targeted women who refused to have sex with him or who were not passionate enough during sexual encounters. Honka had a history of failed marriages due to heavy alcohol consumption, and when very drunk, he would vent his aggression on women. He had a squint and a speech impediment, making him stand out. To get rid of the stench, Honka torched the flat, but firefighters noticed mummified remains among the ashes, and police were called. Initially, he confessed to the murders but later withdrew his statement, claiming not to remember anything. He claimed he took the lives of his victims in court because they mocked his preference for oral coupling over straight coupling. Honka was found guilty of 1 count of murder and 3 counts of manslaughter, and was sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment in a psychiatric hospital. Due to his chronic abuse of alcohol, his diminished mental capacity was considered a mitigating factor. He was released from prison in 1993 and spent his last years in a nursing home under the name of Peter Jensen, passing away in a Hamburg hospital on the 19th of October, 1998. Number 12. Amelia Dyer. Amelia Dyer is considered one of the most notorious murderers in British history. She operated as a baby farmer during the Victorian era, a practice that was prevalent at the time. Baby farmers would adopt unwanted children for a fee, promising that the children would be well taken care of, but in reality, many were mistreated and even murdered. Dyer, who had training as a nurse and a midwife, assured clients that children under her care would be given a safe and loving home. However, this couldn't have been further from the truth. Dyer allowed children to die from starvation and neglect, and when that wasn't enough, she resorted to giving them mother's friend, an opium-laced syrup that would quiet them as they suffered through starvation. Eventually, she even moved on to faster methods of murder for the sole purpose of increasing her profit. It wasn't until an infant's body was found in the Thames and traced back to one of Dyer's many aliases, Mrs. Thomas, that authorities began to investigate her. When they searched her residence, the smell of human remains was overwhelming, although no bodies were found. Dyer admitted to just 1 murder, but experts believe that she may have killed anywhere between 200 to 400 children based on the timeline of her activities. Amelia Dyer was ultimately hanged on June 10, 1896, for her crimes. Despite only being convicted of 1 murder, her actions represent a dark period in British history. Number 11. Randy Kraft. Randy Kraft, also known as the Scorecard Killer, was a serial criminal and sexual predator who primarily targeted young Caucasian men and teenage boys in their late teens to mid-20s. He often picked up his victims from gay bars, hitchhikers, or runaways. Kraft's crimes took place in California during the 1970s and 1980s, and his victims were among the many bodies found near highways. While initially believed to be the work of a single serial criminal dubbed the Highway Killer, it was later discovered that Kraft was one of 3 perpetrators, the others being William Bonin and Patrick Kearney. Kraft's modus operandi included biting his victims and inserting objects such as socks. Many of his victims were also found barefoot, which led some to suspect that he had a foot fetish. Kraft was caught in May 1983 when the California Highway Patrol pulled him over for driving under the influence. A deceased man, Terry Gambrell, was found in the back seat of Kraft's car. Further investigation revealed tranquilizers, prescription drugs, and pornographic photographs of young men, many of whom were deceased. Kraft's home was also searched, where more evidence and his scorecard was found. Kraft's scorecard listed his victims by strange nicknames related to their locations or personal habits. He was charged with 16 murders, including a previously unidentified John Doe nicknamed Airplane Hill. Kraft was found guilty on all counts, as well as some related charges of sodomy and torture. He was initially sentenced to death, but the sentence was upheld in 2000, and he is currently serving his sentence on death row at San Quentin. Number 10. Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper was an American serial criminal who murdered 10 people, including his grandparents and mother. At 15, Kemper murdered both of his grandparents because he wanted to know what it felt like. He was released at 21 and began picking up female hitchhikers in his car, equipped with tools for his murderous desires. He initially let these women go, but he soon began slaying them. His first victims were Mary Ann Pesci and Anita Lucchesa, 2 Fresno State students. Kemper had intercourse with them after taking their lives. He continued his spree, targeting 4 more women, and disposed of parts in various locations, earning him the nickname Co-Ed Butcher. In April 1973, Kemper murdered his mother and her friend, Sally Hallett. After an unpleasant exchange, Kemper attacked his mother, striking her with a hammer and dismembering her body, as he did with the rest of his victims. Kemper then hid his mother's body parts and called her friend, inviting her to the house before taking her life. Kemper was charged with 8 counts of first degree and went on trial in October 1973. He was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to 8 concurrent life sentences. When asked by the judge what he thought his punishment should be, Kemper said he should be tortured to death. He is currently serving his time at California Medical Facility in Vacaville. Kemper's early signs of trouble and his troubled relationship with his mother were evident before his crimes spree. Despite his psychological issues and doctors' recommendation that he not live with his mother, Kemper moved in with her after his release from prison. Number 9. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was an American serial criminal who committed heinous crimes in the 1970s. Ted's last defense team member, attorney Polly Nelson, called him the very definition of heartless evil. He kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and took the lives of many young women and girls, and finally confessed to 30 murders committed in 7 states between 1974 and 1978. However, the actual number of his victims may be significantly higher. Bundy had a charming personality and was physically attractive, which he used to his advantage to gain the trust of his victims and society. He would approach women in public areas, pretending to need help or impersonating an authority figure. He would trick them into being led away, knock them out, and take them elsewhere to sexually assault them before taking their lives. Bundy would often return to the bodies of his victims to perform sexual acts. He kept the heads of at least 12 of his victims as souvenirs in his apartment. In 1975, Bundy was arrested and jailed in Utah for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault, becoming a suspect in many unsolved homicides across several states. Facing murder charges in Colorado, Bundy escaped twice and committed further assaults in Florida, including 3 murders, before being recaptured in 1978. He received 3 death sentences in 2 trials for the Florida homicides and was executed at Florida State Prison in Rayford on January 24, 1989. Number 8. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei Chikatilo, also known as the Butcher of Rostov, was a notorious serial criminal from the former Soviet Union. From 1978 to 1990, he terrorized the country by sexually assaulting, mutilating, and murdering at least 50 women and children. In 1992, he was convicted of 52 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Chikatilo's usual method was to approach vulnerable young runaways and homeless children, trick them into following him to an isolated spot, and then take their lives by stabbing or strangulation. He would then go on to violently mutilate their bodies. Shockingly, Chikatilo later revealed that the only way he could achieve sexual pleasure was through murder. He also targeted adult women working as prostitutes. Ultimately, Chikatilo confessed in great detail to 34 murders and eventually admitted to 22 more that investigators had not connected to him. He was charged with 53 counts of murder in 1992, and he was found guilty of 52 of them. 2 years later, in February of 1994, Chikatilo was executed for his unspeakable crimes with a single gunshot to the head. Number 7. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, also known as the Toolbox Killers, were 2 American serial criminals and sexual predators who committed the kidnapping, sexual assault, torture, and murder of 5 teenage girls in Southern California over 5 months in 1979. They became known as the Toolbox Killers because most instruments used in their crime square items customarily stored inside a household toolbox, such as pliers, ice picks, and sledgehammers. Bittaker and Norris kidnapped the teens, some of whom were walking home or hitchhiking at the time, and drove them to local mountains where they would torture, sexually assault, and murder them. The girls ranged from 13 to 18 years old, and in addition to their horrific torture techniques, the men recorded some of their sessions for amusement. They were only caught after Norris told another former inmate about their devious exploits, who then told the police, leading to the pair's arrests. Norris eventually testified against Bittaker after pleading guilty to all charges in exchange for prosecutors not seeking the death penalty against him. A Los Angeles County jury convicted Bittaker of 5 counts of murder and 5 counts of kidnapping and other charges, sentencing him to death on March 22, 1981. As California avoided executions for decades, Bittaker died in prison in 2019. Norris was sentenced to a term of 45 years to life and passed 2 months later. Number 6. Richard Cottingham. Richard Cottingham operated in New York and New Jersey from 1967 to 1980. He was dubbed the Torso Killer for his gruesome habit of dismembering his victims and leaving only their torsos behind. One of his most heinous crimes involved dismembering 2 prostitutes in a motel room, taking their hands and heads with him, and setting the room on fire. Cottingham was eventually caught in 1981 after being seen fleeing from an attempted murder. Although he was convicted of only 6 murders, Cottingham claims to have committed between 85 and 100 murders. His confirmed crimes resulted in 9 convictions and 8 confessions under non-prosecution agreements, leading to multiple life sentences in New Jersey prisons. Cottingham had a disturbing modus operandi, often targeting female sex workers in their late teens to mid-20s. He would approach them in bars, drug them, and take them to remote locations, typically motels, where he would bind, gag, torture, and stab them before strangling them. He would sometimes remove and dispose of his victims' heads and hands to avoid identification. Cottingham also took trophies, such as jewelry and personal items belonging to his victims. 4 survivors testified against him, resulting in 3 convictions and 1 acquittal. Number 5. Dennis Nilsen. Dennis Nilsen was a Scottish serial criminal and necrophile who took the lives of at least 12 young men and boys in London between 1978 and 1983. He was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment on November 4, 1983. The original recommendation was for him to serve at least 25 years, but in December 1994, it was changed to a whole life sentence. Nilsen was later imprisoned at Full Sutton Maximum Security Prison. Nilsen's crimes occurred at 2 North London addresses where he lived between 1978 and 1983. He would deceive his victims into coming to these addresses and strangle or drown them. After each murder, Nilsen would bathe and dress the victim's body, which he would keep for extended periods before dissecting and disposing of the remains, either by burning them in a bonfire or flushing them down a toilet. Nilsen became known as the Muswell Hill Murderer for his crimes in the Muswell Hill area of North London. He passed away on May 12, 2018, at York Hospital due to a pulmonary embolism and a retroperitoneal hemorrhage after undergoing surgery to repair an abdominal aortic aneurysm. Number 4. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster, was an American serial criminal and sex offender who murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Dahmer's crimes were horrific, involving necrophilia, cannibalism, and the permanent preservation of body parts. Most of his victims were murdered by strangulation after being drugged with sedatives. In some cases, Dahmer also attempted to induce a submissive state in his victims by injecting hydrochloric acid or boiling water into their frontal lobes. From an early age, Dahmer had a strange fascination for deceased animals. When he was 4, he saw his father removing animal bones underneath their home. This seemed to intrigue Dahmer, and he became obsessed with animal bones, calling them his fiddlesticks. He sometimes searched for more bones around their home and even explored live animals to find their bones. Despite being diagnosed with multiple personality disorders, he was found to be legally sane and was sentenced to 15 terms of life imprisonment for his crimes in Wisconsin. He received an additional life sentence for a homicide committed in Ohio. In 1994, Dahmer was fatally beaten by another inmate while in prison. Number 3. David Parker Ray. David Ray, also known as the Toy Box Killer, was a notorious criminal who kidnapped, tortured, and sexually assaulted women for years. Although he was never convicted of murder, he was accused by his accomplices of taking the lives of several women, and it's believed he may have murdered as many as 60 women. He created a mobile torture chamber, a semi-trailer which he named his Toy Box, that was soundproofed and equipped with instruments for sexual torture. He kidnapped women of low socioeconomic status and held them captive for several weeks to months, subjecting them to horrific sexual abuse, often with a range of tools including whips, chains, pulleys, straps, clamps, leg spreader bars, surgical blades, and saws. Ray even built his own electrical generator, which was used to shock his victims. It is suspected that Ray had help from accomplices, including women he was romantically involved with and even his own daughter. He would then administer drugs to make them forget what had happened before abandoning them by the side of the road. Ray had a mirror mounted in the ceiling above an obstetric table to which he strapped his victims and wooden contraptions that immobilized them while he had his dogs and sometimes other friends take advantage of them. He played an audio tape recording of his voice for his victims whenever they regained consciousness. In 2001, he was convicted of kidnapping and torture and received a 224-year sentence. However, he died of a heart attack soon after his convictions in 2 cases. Number 2. Luis Garavito. Luis Garavito, also known as the Beast or Goofy, is a Colombian serial criminal, sex offender, pedophile, and necrophile who confessed to sexually assaulting, torturing, mutilating, and murdering between 100 to 400 minors, mainly young boys, in the western Colombian region in October 1999. He began his heinous crimes in the autumn of 1980 by torturing and sexually assaulting minors aged between 6 and 16. It is estimated that he had raped and tortured at least 200 minors before he committed more crimes on an additional 189 minors in Colombia from the 4th of October 1992 to the 21st of April 1999. He also took the lives of 4 more children in Ecuador during the summer of 1998. Garavito targeted children from humble backgrounds, using gifts to lure them away to secluded spots where he would sexually assault and torture them for prolonged periods. He would disguise himself and offer work for money to prevent suspicion. Satanic rituals were incorporated into the murders, and Garavito's sexual climax would coincide with decapitating the child. Garavito was apprehended on the 22nd of April 1999 for attempting to assault 12-year-old John Ivan Sabogal sexually, and remained under suspicion for several months until he finally confessed on the 28th of October 1999. He was sentenced to 1,853 years and 9 days in jail for all his crimes. Garavito is confirmed to have murdered at least 193 minors in Colombia and Ecuador, making him the most prolific serial killer in modern history. According to his confession in 2003, he may have murdered 23 minors and 5 adults, increasing his confirmed murder victim count to 221 if true. Number 1. Albert Fish. Albert Fish is a name that still sends shivers down the spines of those who know his story. Born in Washington, D.C. in 1870, Fish had a childhood plagued by tragedy and abuse. When he was 5, his father passed away, and his mother was forced to leave him in an orphanage. There, Fish experienced physical abuse that he realized he enjoyed. As he grew older, Fish's disturbing proclivities only worsened. He became a sex worker in New York City and began preying on young boys, sexually assaulting and torturing them for pleasure. But it was the kidnapping and murder of young Grace Budd that cemented Fish's place in history as one of America's most depraved serial criminals. In 1928, Fish responded to an advertisement for a job and arranged to meet 18-year-old Edward Budd at his family's home. But when he arrived, Fish became fixated on 10-year-old Grace Budd and decided to take her instead. Fish lured Grace away from her family by pretending to be a friend, promising to take her to a birthday party. But instead, he took her to an abandoned house, where he took her life. He later sent a letter to Grace's family describing the details of her murder in graphic detail. Despite his crimes, Fish managed to evade justice for several years, but a slip-up in the form of an anonymous letter to Grace's parents ultimately led to his capture. After the arrest, Fish admitted to a few other murders, one of 9-year-old Frances McDonnell, who never returned home after a day spent playing catch with friends. Fish also confessed to the murder of 4-year-old Billy Gaffney via a letter to his lawyer. Fish was found guilty and sentenced to death by electrocution, a punishment he willingly accepted. After Fish was put to death, his lawyer stated he had final words from Fish, amounting to nothing more than handwritten notes. The lawyer refused to read them, stating, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." Of all the twisted and disturbed individuals to ever walk the earth, these serial criminals are right up there. Their crimes are a chilling reminder of just how dark and depraved human beings can be, and it's hard not to feel a sense of fear and unease when we hear about them. That being said, we hope this video was interesting for you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.